Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming here today. My name is Joe Hill. I'm one of the policy directors at Restate. Restate's a cross-party think tank which works on public service reform. We're here at Conservative Party conference yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We have plenty of events here in Manchester Art Gallery. So if you enjoy today, please come back. We're in a conversation with Mel Stride, Chancellor of the tomorrow. You don't enjoy today, don't come back, I guess. You're not welcome anymore. We're here today with the last part of the day talking about economic growth. The title of today's panel is Geared for Growth, a Conservative Plan for Rebooting the Economy. We did a very similar event with a couple of familiar speakers at the Conservative Party conference last year, 12 months on, after the things they said about what we could do to get the economy growing and what Conservative vision for it looked like. I'm interested to know whether some of our familiar faces have changed their mind about something. And for our new guests, I'll also be asking them the same question. I don't need to, I think, spell out why this is such an important topic, but I'm going to anyway. Economic growth is the great driver of prosperity in this country. It has been stagnant for a long period, ever since the financial crisis, a very little amount of economic growth. That has huge implications both for living standards, also for the strength and quality of public finances and the quality of a social contract, the ability to the government to provide the things it needs to for the public, for citizens, for civil society and businesses. So unlocking this is really crucial, and we have excellent lined up to discuss today. Joining us today with Gareth Davies, who's Shadow Secretary and also Shadow Minister for Business and Trade, Athan Branford MD for Chester South and Edinburgh. Mark Wallace is the CEO of Total Politics Group. I'm getting out of order now, but and Tim Sutton, who's a partner at KPMG, and I'd like to say a particular thanks to KPMG for partnering with us on this and helping support our Conservative Party conference programme. In terms of the format for today, we're going to have some sort of opening remarks and reflections. I'm going to do a few follow-up questions and answers on the panel, and then we're going to do audience Q&A. Unfortunately for today, we don't have a roving mic, so you're going to have to just project and work with us, and we'll come to you for questions. So please, as the panel's going on, start thinking about what question you want to ask our illustrious panel. I think I'm going to start by asking every member of the panel, what does a Conservative vision for economic growth look like? And we'll start with maybe Gareth, and we'll just work down the panel.
Well, thank you very much, and great to see such a good turnout for what is essentially one of the most important questions I think any of us need to be asking. But let's not forget that we had a pretty good plan just as we were leaving. We left with reasonably good growth, which has now been sort of put back into reverse or into neutral at the very best by this government. We can come on to how that's happened. But I think for me, there's kind of three things you want in terms of a growth strategy, and it comes down to people, capital and ideas. If you've got a country where you've got a high degree of participation in the workforce, then you have higher productivity. We currently have 9 million people who can work, who don't work. I think most people want to work. I believe, as most people do, in the dignity of work and the security that a regular paycheck brings. But for various reasons, we've not done a good enough job as a country making sure those people are playing a part in the economy. And so the first thing is to make sure that you've got the right dynamic when it comes to workforce participation. And the second part of people is making sure that you are a welcoming environment for the best and the very brightest that the world has to offer, and that you're growing the talent of the future in your own country as well. And that two-pronged approach to bringing in great thinkers and nurturing great thinkers, I think is underpriced when it comes to political discourse all too often, but makes a huge impact. And then there's a tremendous need across governments around the world for capital, for money, for investment. And so, yes, of course, you need to create an environment in which investment is free-flowing, and that comes down to, yes, tax, but also stability of policy, stability and certainty, and a reduction in regulation. But it's also about being innovative in attracting capital and then mobilising capital through institutions and mechanisms that you have available to you. And we utilised some of this while we were in office, and I think we could go a bit further. And then finally, it's all really about ideas and innovation. And if you are a country that is pushing forward in terms of who is creating the ideas, by that I mean new technology, new medicines, and you have in place the investment and the capital to drive those ideas into execution, you have a country that is more secure, a country that is more competitive, and ultimately a country that will grow much faster than it is today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. It's an easy job for me because I've got Gareth sitting next to me, so everything he says I agree with. We've obviously got a big job ahead of us. I mean, this Labour government is essentially bringing the economy to its knees. Growth, as we've heard, has flatlined. We've got inflation at double the target it should be. Our national debt is nearly the size of our entire economy, and the interest payments on that are more than we spend on the entire education budget or the policing budget or the defence budget. So this is huge, and we've heard about the number of people, something like 6.5 million people on out-of-work benefits. This is a huge challenge that we've got to address. Obviously, from a Conservative perspective, thinking about reducing taxes, reducing regulation, the burden of regulation is going to be so important to give businesses confidence that they can invest, that they can employ people, that they can grow and do that hard work. Thinking beyond just what we need to do in terms of taxes, I think we need to be considering ensuring that we have everybody who's got the right skills to do the jobs that need doing and the infrastructure to make that possible. We need to think about how people are going to get the jobs of the future, responding to things like AI and how it's changing the jobs market, and essentially saying, yes, for many people, university might be the route to success, but there are other ways of getting those skills for the jobs of the future. We also need to sort our infrastructure out. I represent Chester South and Eddisbury, which is a beautiful constituency in the northwest of England. But there are some real issues with connectivity, both digital and physical connectivity. And I'll give you just one example. Holyhead is the UK's second busiest port. The rail connection between Cheshire and Holyhead still isn't electrified. You know, we just don't have the basics right. We don't have the mobile and digital connectivity, and we want businesses to come and set up and grow. They need to be able to rely on having those fundamentals. One of the things that I think we were going to talk about was kind of regional leadership and what we can do in terms of thinking beyond just London and the South East, but to spreading growth around the country. In Cheshire, we are going to have a mayor for the first time. Obviously, people will have different views on devolution, but ultimately, given that it's happening, we need to make sure that it works for us. And you only need to look at what Ben Houchin has done in Teesside to see how there can be a real impact. You know, things like setting up a free port, targeted tax reliefs, investing in transport, investing there in the international airport, and essentially saying we're open for business and not just giving words, but also the actions to back it up. And there's no reason why we can't do that in the northwest. We've got great cities. We've got Manchester, where we are. We've got Liverpool. We've got Chester, and that's really, really fantastic opportunities. But as well as regional, I think we also need to think about rural areas and the potential that rural areas have for growth. They've often been left behind, and I had a good stat, basically. The National Innovation Centre for Rural Enterprise highlighted that rural businesses are really struggling with skills shortages and labour gaps. And so we've got to focus on fixing some of the infrastructure issues they have, but also bringing training and opportunity to these communities. So overall for me, that Conservative approach is about, yes, reducing taxes and regulation, but also investing in skills and infrastructure and recognising that rural communities can be part of our growth story too.
Yeah, so I won't do large C Conservative, given I'm here from KPMG Big K instead. I'll do a small C, I suppose. What would a small C Conservative plan for growth and maybe a small R radical plan for growth look like? But I think it's important to understand what the growth problem is and how big a growth problem it is. And what we're not in is a series of boom and bust cycles. I sort of personally feel slightly nostalgic for the days of boom and bust, because at least we got booms back then, and now we just sort of get a bit, what my daughter would call essentially sort of mid performance. By the way, I think a massive new city with very low tax in Anglesey would be a brilliant levelling up opportunity, making the most of the Irish market, etc. So that's my view, not Kevin's view. So what are the things that have led to stagnation, particularly stagnation in productivity growth and stagnation in investment rates, pretty much since 2008? Some of that was, yes, the unwinding of excesses before the financial crisis, but that was only really a small part of it if you look at the history. It's been two or three things, and I think the solution to getting back to meaningful growth is to address at least two of those three things. One of them is we've gone from a history where, in the UK, generally speaking, households in particular didn't save enough and spent too much, to one where households are spending too little and are saving too much. Businesses which were always a little bit penny pinching in the UK compared with our US or continental colleagues have become even more asset sweaters, where just making the use of what we've got and trying to be the last mover when it comes to major capital investment has really led to a lot of our decline in productivity. And the question is, well, is that down to government policy? Was it a cultural thing, a cultural problem we've got? So that's one big problem. Another problem, which is where you see a big gap between us and the United States, and I would argue the majority of the gap between us and the United States, if you exclude availability of capital, has been down to the cost of energy over several years. And likewise, actually, France, with its nuclear power base, rode out the Ukraine crisis much better than we did. Germany, until the Ukraine crisis, also had pretty cheap energy costs. That's a harder one to fix, but it's certainly something the government needs to think about. And then the third one, and this is back to the small c conservative, I suppose, is we have been pretty unlucky as a Western world in the last decade or more, and we've simply had a rolling series of crises that would test any kind of system. We had the financial crisis, we then had the Eurozone crisis. The UK had its Brexit. That was a bit more of a sort of specific thing for us, but it did affect the rest of Europe as well. Then we had the COVID pandemic, pretty much unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. Then we had the Ukraine war with the massive return of inflation. And I think just a few years of none of those sorts of things happening would probably help us to get back to some sort of equilibrium too.
A great policy prescription for the UK to be more lucky as well, which we'll take away. Thank you. And finally, Mark.
Thank you. That very much brings to mind something my wife said when I first had the opportunity to move from working in comms and campaigns to working in journalism. And she said, look, I appreciate why this is very exciting, but comms seems like it's going quite well. And then she issued the fateful words, is there going to be enough politics to write about? And that was 2013, and somewhere the cursed monkey's paw kind of twitched. And unfortunately, there's an endless supply of politics, and the parliamentarians on the panel will attest that their colleagues keep committing acts of news, which keeps the rest of us in business, for which we're totally grateful. To get to the topic, I pick out a couple of general principles I think we need to bear in mind as Conservatives when looking for growth and delivering it, and a couple of specifics, particularly to this country and particularly in the local and regional setting. The first thing is, just like any business would do, we need to make sure we're measuring what matters. When we talk about growth, I think we are really yet, as a political culture, as Westminster in particular, as my colleagues in the press, are yet to really wake up to the fact that essentially we've been targeting the wrong thing when we talk about growth. We've talked for a very long time purely about GDP. GDP is what matters. We rank countries by GDP, and we're overtaking France or vice versa in terms of GDP. We're failing to consider GDP per capita, which ultimately growth has to be something which is not simply on a spreadsheet, it has to be something which is felt by people. And if I'd had an email from Restate last week saying, great news, we're adding 5 minutes to the panelist speaking time, I would have been delighted for a week to think I had longer to indulge my love of the sound of my own voice. But if I then turned up and found that you added 6 extra panelists, it would have turned out not to be quite as advertised. And I think that is something we've had a distinct experience of in this country, where effectively we can flatter ourselves, and dare I say political parties come election time in government have a good reason to try and flatter the message and say, look, here's GDP. If you put it in GDP per capita, this country has performed even worse than previously advertised. And that's a really serious issue. Obviously, it springs from some of the topics we've talked about in terms of productivity, springs from issues in terms of capital allocation, the tax and the investment market. But if we're not measuring what matters in the first place, then we're going to be chasing a false goal. And people around the country, the vast bulk of them, are not economists, but they're not stupid. They can feel the fact that when politicians stand up repeatedly and say, well, growth is up, we're continuing to grow, but everything either feels exactly as it was or worse, more expensive. When people are able to save, they then get penalised for doing so, etc., etc., etc. They can see this. A couple of other things I'd pick out. As a general principle, I think Conservatives in the coming years need to take on our national cultural dislike of the idea of a postcode lottery, so-called. If there is a postcode lottery, as in something that's forced on you by chance, that is indeed a bad thing. But if you have a patchwork quilt of a country where different places have different policies for different things, I think that's not only natural, but actively desirable. The fact is that we would recognise that every single town, village, constituency in the country is different in its character, its challenges, and its interests. And if we are trying to say we're going to solve all of those problems by simply having one top-down, universal set of policies on every front, then of course we're going to fail to satisfy most, if not all of them. That links, I think, to two more things I pick out. One is changing our attitude to risk. The fact is that when we think about regulation, when the press cover things, when politicians and also a lot of voters talk about risk, they view it only as a bad thing. The fact is that risk is the flip side of opportunity. And one of the things I really hope we can learn from the pandemic is that be more like the MHRA, who understood what risk is and is not, and understood how statistics work, and said that when a global plague comes along, your risk assessment and your barriers for making risk-informed decisions change when it comes to authorising vaccines. I think a lot of regulators are yet to pick up that great example, and that was a big moment when, frankly, something which is a technical matter is actually in the public eye. I think we could see that inform our regulatory system. And finally, I'd absolutely echo what you said about energy. The fact is, energy and housing are the two things that really underpin so much of our growth issue, as well as our GDP per capita issue and our feeling poorer and poorer issue. At a time when government struggles to try to fix everything and ends up fixing nothing, it should just focus on a couple of things to start with. And we've deliberately, for 20 years or more, chosen to make energy more expensive, and we now, as a nation, lament the fact that we don't have a steel industry, we find it harder to integrate high tech, people have cost of living crisis, and there's not enough money to go around. What's the
Thank you very much. You've all in various ways preempted my follow-up question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is about the role of regions in our economy and what the future of growth looks like in a kind of national picture and context. Britain is unusual in the G7 of the Western world in how centralised our economy is around London and the Great South East. The last Conservative government was elected on a platform of levelling up and changing the kind of economic opportunity across the country. And actually, even prior to that, had for many years been kind of leading the way in mayoral devolution. Now that current Labour government has a view of how regionalism is going to drive part of the economic growth agenda it wants. And I'm kind of interested in the role in each of these things, a kind of as we devolve more power and more accountability, particularly for the economy, to particular regions, what's the right way of doing that? What's the wrong way of doing that? And is there a dividing line between what a Conservative government would do, what the last Conservative government did do, and what the Labour government is currently doing?
Yes,
yeah, why don't we go in the same order?
So you're right, we were elected in 2019, I was elected then, on a manifesto pledge to level up the country, and that was, by the way, absolutely right. And it resonated with people I grew up with in Leeds and across the country, where all too often we talk about growth in London and the South East. It's not to say that we wanted to level down London and the South East, it's that we wanted to achieve a greater balance of productivity and opportunity, actually, no matter where you come from. And that was absolutely right. We had the investment mechanisms, institutions, and funding in place to be able to do that. But as actually really welcome you know, the comments from Tim about events happened, and we got slightly sidetracked by a number of different things that ended up costing us hundreds of billions of pounds. But the principle, the policy, the intent and the ambition was absolutely right. And I wonder if we hadn't had to clear up a lot of mess post-financial crisis in labour, if we hadn't had the pandemic and inflation boom and energy crisis on the back of Ukraine, what we could have actually achieved more of when it comes to living up. But that's perhaps for another day. I think if you look at a couple of the policies that we did successfully introduce, investment zones is one area that I would highlight that doesn't get talked about enough, but that was an area of, yes, the evolution of fiscal policy, but it was actually very successful at getting in some anchor investors to specific places around the country where you could then achieve what's called an agglomeration effect of you have one big employer who goes in and then a whole ecosystem moves in behind it. And then the areas around it, say it's in Manchester, the villages, the towns around it will all benefit from that, and then you get the infrastructure and everything flows from it. But the principle, the policy, which was quite remarkable for the Treasury actually at the time, I can tell you, was that let's basically give the local authority the option. You can have money to stimulate demand for the area or get a deal done, or you can drop taxation, you can drop business taxation. And we actually have a pretty good relationship with, of all colours of authority leaders. And the success can be seen by the announcements that we made, and not least the fact that Labour have now carried on that policy. And so that's an area where I would just highlight, it's been very successful in the United States, where the state doesn't get heavily involved, but just gives it a nudge and allows private investment to come in. But just on one of Mark's points, one of the things that we did do that I would want to see us do again is not pick winners, but just say, look, where do we have a comparative advantage as a country? Where can we win globally? What are we good at? What do we genuinely believe we can go to the international investment community and say, you don't need to go anywhere else. Life sciences, film and entertainment, robotics, perhaps AI. These are areas that I think we can really focus on in terms of state policy and then implement fiscal support through those areas of focus. And then just say, going back to my earlier remarks about people, capital and ideas, how do you align every single department around making sure you've got the best and the brightest people being trained, nurtured, and then bringing people in to work in those industries? How do you ensure that you've got an environment that brings in the investment capital to those industries? And how do you make sure that when we have an idea, to Mark's point about the narrow chair, how do you ensure that you can go to market, you can get pragmatic about risk taking so that you can lead the world? And I think the pandemic, for all its many troubles and challenges, that was one thing that I took away from that, which is that we can, if we really want to, we can really turbocharge our ambition when it comes to innovation and creating things, and we could do it a lot better than that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, really, I think obviously I represent a constituency in the northwest, so the idea of spreading growth regionally is very important to my constituency and to the region that I'm part of. And Mark made an excellent point about that you can't have one kind of top-down universal set of policies that are going to necessarily apply to every area. Perhaps devolution is a way of addressing that. It certainly means that you can look at what the specific challenges are for certain areas. Transport is definitely an issue for us in my constituency and really across the northwest. And we did have policies where George Osborne introduced Northern Powerhouse Rail, and there was a real commitment to trying to improve our rail connections to grow in the northwest. And I think we do need to look at and revisit how we can really have an impact with those kinds of policies. And what I was talking about before with digital connectivity, I when I speak to people in London, I think they really just can't understand how challenging it is in some parts of the country in terms of getting any kind of decent broadband or mobile phone connectivity. That is massively holding us back. It's also about making sure we've got the skills that are fit for the future. I think that Gareth made a really good point about the fact that there are areas where we are already global leaders, things like pharmaceuticals, life sciences, etc., but also kind of thinking about what are those areas going to be for the future, and are we equipping young people with those skills, whatever it might be in AI, tech, digital, so that actually we're creating those ecosystems to ensure that those kind of industries might grow in the northwest or the northeast or anywhere else, southwest. Don't want to leave out any part of the country. So really that focus on skills, investment, but also fundamentally on getting just the basic infrastructure right.
Tim.
So what we're talking about is it's two things that can sometimes seem in opposition. So one of them is devolution, regional and local devolution. The other is government industrial strategy. And I think there can be an assumption that if you do one, you can't do the other. I think actually the best examples out there do both. And we've got one of the things we don't do very well as a country is actually research and understand what other countries do, and actually compare our system with those countries and work out which bits we could take and which we shouldn't. And there are lots of good examples out there of devolution done in different ways. I'm a strong believer that we need way more devolution, including going into significant areas of the tax system, so that whether it's a region or a local authority can make decisions around where it raises money and then how it spends them. But there are examples that I don't think necessarily would fit us. So if you take it at one end of the spectrum, you have quite hands-off federal systems. The US would be one of them, Germany would be another one, where pretty much allow regions or states in the US's case to compete with each other. And I think that works in a vast market like the US, because they're happy to leave some places to go to pot, essentially, because they know that other places will grow. I don't think that works so well here. Then at the other end of the spectrum, we have countries like Singapore, the UAE, where it is very top-down, it's regional, but the government decides exactly where we're going to create this enterprise zone, what cluster we're going to build here, and I'm not sure that works for us either. My view is there are quite a lot of areas where international comparisons would suggest we would get better clustering and we would get better and faster decisions, particularly on things like planning, if there were more local accountability for making decisions on tax and spend. And that means politicians letting go of some power. But there are also certain industries, whether that's nuclear, whether it's infrastructure, the rollout of broadband, as you mentioned, and also industries that rely on government financing to do what they need to do, defence and pharmaceuticals being two of them, where the central government cannot step back. We're too small an economy for central government to step back completely. I think that the secret is choosing which and which and making sure we've got the right mix.
So I think there are two particular positives I would pick out about what's been happening in recent years and is continuing to happen in terms of devolution. The first, I think it's clearly a good thing to align multiple aspects of policy on broadly the same boundaries. And the fact is that we still have a really weird collection. I grew up on North Tyneside, where because of the 1974 local government reforms, we have councillors elected in thirds, and on the fourth year there's a year off, which is meant to be a metropolitan county, but it doesn't exist. So we have all this kind of weird mix of stuff and different powers sitting in different places. I think there are various changes, thinking about some of the changes affecting the Isle of Wight, for example, at the minute, where things are going off a bit half-cocked, and actually there's different boundaries being established on different types of policy currently, which is in the state, but I think there is an opportunity to align things. That includes, obviously, transport, discussions about public health, for example. I think so there are opportunities there. Similarly, the fact that, to a certain extent, bringing some kind of egos into this is a positive thing. I mean, we're here in Manchester, we heard Andy Burnham a lot in recent times, but particularly on the Conservative fringe today, having politicians who are responsible somewhere, who can stand up and then compete with one another for, look at the impact Ben Hampshire had. I mean, that's a remarkable impact, has already been mentioned. That's a good thing in our politics. Where I think there are some downsides. Firstly, I disagree a bit about the idea that the idea of some areas being allowed to basically have consequences of getting things wrong. I wonder whether we can have, I agree with you about accountability, but I wonder whether we can have sovereignty and accountability without the risk of consequences if the mistaken decisions are made. The question is, what kind of safety net do we have for that? And I also think there's a slight risk that, as Conservatives, we should remember that devolution is not just down to local authorities. The ultimate form of devolution is down to people and to individuals and households and families and so on. When you think about the planning system, I think that does offer some ways to start to give a bit more freedom for delivering national objectives through local planning. For example, if you were to say, build a nuclear power station somewhere and all of the houses within however many 100 metres or kilometres are going to get free energy for the next 5 years, for instance, you can start to localise some of the benefits rather than just the consequences. I don't know if anyone in the room has been involved in planning permissions, but Section 106, which was meant to compensate local communities from developers, mistook local councils as if they are local communities, which they are not. They are local forms of government. There's £6 billion of unspent Section 106 money sitting in local authorities' accounts across the country right now, because it was allocated and hypothecated to particular developments that then haven't happened, and theoretically it can't be spent. And we have local authorities that say they don't have enough money. I think you've probably seen the reports from Reform in Kent today discovering they think there's no way to cut. Surprise. But we have billions of pounds that could have gone to genuine, being devolved to actual local communities, the neighbours of developments, for example. And instead it's literally festering back.
I'm gonna just try and tease out something where I think there's maybe a little bit of difference on panels and where maybe in the short term, like we can't all have everything the ways we need to make some decisions. We've sort of talked about maybe not picking winners, but thinking about where our competitive strengths are and where we can have a greater industrial strategy. We've also talked about areas where it's about creating the environment for better business investment, jobs, skills, but not being prescriptive. And then we've had a discussion about kind of what level do you do that, kind of the extent to which you can kind of do that regionally versus nationally. I kind of between industrial strategy and kind of laissez-faire and kind of creating the environment but not making prescriptions, where should we be? And I'm going to that's not a 1 to 10 scale, but I'm going to sort of ask each panelist maybe kind of where do you think we could be or should be?
Can I give you a politician's answer and say, I think that what I would point out is that first of all, there's a lot of, particularly in our time, there's a lot of obsession with calling for an industrial strategy, or just calling something an industrial strategy. Well, Labour have one of those, and how's that going? We had an industrial strategy, we didn't put it in a booklet or a brochure, but it was very clear what we wanted to do, particularly in the last couple of years, in terms of stimulating growth and stimulating business investment. But to give you the politician's answer to what you just asked, you cannot have, no matter what you call it, you cannot have pro-growth deregulation at the same time as incredibly high and anti-growth taxation. It doesn't matter what you call it, unless both of those things work together, you're not going to grow the economy, you're not going to achieve a balance in your regional productivity, you're not going to have a competitive country, people are not going to want to come here. And that's what we've got at the moment. There are some things that this government will do that I welcome, particularly on deregulation, or at least the warm words on deregulation. But that is being completely undone by the anti-growth taxation that has already been implemented and the uncertainty around what may be implemented. And so whatever we do when we get back in 3 or 4 years' time, we need to make sure all parts of our strategy need to be rowing towards the same outcome and aim, and that is not what is happening right now, I would argue.
fantastic politician's answer. Afra?
I think government is particularly bad at picking winners, so the idea that we are going to be able to do that and get it right is going to be extremely challenging. Having said that, we can make sure that we are investing in skills and that we are trying to create the conditions for growth, even if it's just at a national level. And exactly as Gareth said, we could be providing the tax incentives that would encourage businesses themselves to work out what is the most efficient, effective business for them to create a certain area and getting that clustering together. We've talked about things like enterprise zones, free ports, that are tools that can be used to try and encourage that in particular areas where we need to, but without us actually having to really be prescriptive about what those different businesses or industries should be that we're encouraging.
Brilliant. Tim?
Yeah, I think government can pick winners quite well if it's given the chance. I mean, to be government is just people, isn't it? And people sit in venture capital funds, sort of private equity, etc. They're all essentially picking winners. I think the trouble is you can only pick winners if you're allowed to pick 10, and for 8 of those or 9 of those to fail, and for you not to be voted out in the next election because some of them failed, and that's the issue, isn't it? Because if you're a VC fund and one out of 10 comes good, then you keep goods in. But there are plenty of examples of governments picking winners where they've been onto a dead cert, like the Norwegians with oil and gas and with renewables, like the Americans with defence, etc. In terms of the technocrats' answer, as opposed to a politician's answer on the tax conundrum, I think we need evidence, but it's easier said than done, but evidence-based policy on which tax moves, whether that's up or down, have the biggest effect. I was at a round table this morning where I think the fact is the Laffer curve is real. It's more real in certain areas of the tax system than in others. And no one quite knows where the threshold is, but you can sort of tell, you can test empirically pretty much where it is. But it also works in both directions. So there are certain areas of tax that you could cut, and it wouldn't have that much of an effect on growth either, because it would either go into people's savings or into the areas where people weren't spending money. And there are certain parts of our tax system that, from my experience, are now uncompetitive, particularly parts of corporation tax, not because we've done anything necessarily that egregious, but because other countries, notably the US, have not been staying still themselves. There are other parts of the tax system where something has got to give, because I think of all of the things that happened in the last Parliament, the thing that upset me most, I would say, that really the one policy that I thought was so short-sighted was the curtailing of HS2, and it was a really good example of Treasury penny pinching to save money in the long term, where actually it would have been a pretty good thing to do. So I think sometimes where you can work out what you're raising the money for and put it to good use, sometimes you do need to use the tax system to get there. That's it.
And Mark?
I'm going to take full advantage of the mention of the Laffer curve, because I'm pleased to say our publishing house, Fightback, is publishing Art Laffer's last book next month, called Prosperity Through Growth, which is specifically turning his eye on how the United Kingdom could answer some of these questions. So strongly recommend, available to pre-order, etc. But I think we've had the technocrats, the politicians answer and so on. The journalist answer would ordinarily, at this point, be for me to just rage about politicians who say they want growth and then end up locally opposing building houses or reservoirs or whatever it might be. But actually, I think we need to be a bit more sympathetic to politicians, because it's much easier to say, as someone who's not standing for election, well, we want growth, so we've got to stop saying no to different developments, we need to tell them to sod off and all the rest of it. But actually we need to recognise the political practicality in our electoral system, that it is very difficult for individual MPs or individual councillors to hold the line on things like that, which is why I think the Conservative Party should be exploring ways to align people's interests better. In fact, we should be saying, well, we should recognise that there are real negative kind of externalities of neighbours of development, upon neighbours of developments. There are also perceived externalities and costs to them. So let's have a think about how our system could rebalance that, could create an incentive. if the country as a whole wants, yes, defence infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, but also wants a really big picture of housing from lots of little developments around the country, then the nation should have a kind of local answer to try and incentivise that. It should be the case that you should be, what's sometimes called bribing people to support development. People should be incentivised or compensated. We should be totally open about that, and I think it's an actively really good thing to do, and it would help give the politicians on the panel and their colleagues, they'd be able to go into conversation with constituents to say, here is what we think are the direct upsides to you of this development down the end of your street happening. Here's how we can campaign for those to be bigger. We can negotiate them to be improved. But there at least would be some. There's no point pretending people don't have these annoyances about development. We need to answer the world and address the world as it is.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We're going to go to audience Q&A, but before you rush to put your hands up, I'm just going to establish some quick ground rules for Q&A, which we've developed recently. The